Hello, everyone, and welcome to Coffee Chat. I'm Shay Little, the director of Big Medium, and I'm honored today to be talking with Alberto Mejia. Welcome, Alberto.
I'm here. Hello.
You're here. Welcome.
Good to see you. Good to see you, Shay.
You too. So a quick little bit about yourself. You develop and manage the City of Austin cultural funding programs, as well as creative space development, capacity building, cultural equity, and public-private partnerships and initiatives to serve creative communities. You are also an alumnus of the National Association of Latino Arts and Culture Policy, Advocacy, and Leadership Institutes, and have served as a panelist for local to national grant-making programs, including ARTPLACE and NEA Town. And you are active in cultural policy issues and dialogue, and also serve as a commissioner for District 2 on the City of Austin Community Development Commission. Quite a list of activities. And you and I got to know each other through your time at the Dougherty Arts Center.
Yep.
And then we also both served together on the Austin Creative Alliance Board of Directors.
That's correct, yeah.
Well, why don't you give us a little bit more about what brought you to where you are today?
Sure. So thanks for having me, Shay, and hi to everybody on the call today. Hope everyone's in wellness. I started out, in college. I was rapping. I was a hip hop performer in Northwestern Washington, north of the Seattle area, and that really got me interested in the power of how art can hold space for people, and in particular hip hop culture. And hip hop culture led me into teaching artistry with some really great programs up in the Northwest. At that time, it's called a Partnership for Youth Empowerment. And teaching artistry kind of led me into working with young people in the social service sector, which then led me into those, creative and cultural spaces that also provided social service, such as, El Centro de la Raza in Seattle, even Youngstown Cultural Arts Center, which was a rehabbed old condemned school building that had multi-use art space on the first floor, an alternative school there, and then low-income artist live work housing on the top. So kind of this intersection in my career of teaching artistry, seeing how that intersects with social services and working really with young folks in community, and then getting into cultural space and how those things all intersect together. So that was my career. At that point, I went to grad school in Seattle, Washington to get a public administration degree to learn, how to, to get, the paper back in me, but also, to sort of up my chops in terms of navigating organizational development, politics, and the like. So that moved me along over at Youngstown, became the director there under Randy Engstrom, who's a mentor, a good friend of mine, now is super active on the board of GIA, Grantmakers in the Arts, and also is the head of the Office of Arts and Cultural Affairs in Seattle, Washington. So from Youngstown, I had a stint with EMP Museum, which I think is now MoPOP in Seattle, doing community engagement work for them. Then I was my wife has generational roots in Austin, and her family's super cohesive, and we decided to make a move over here where I took over as manager of the Dougherty Arts Center, with the sort of idea that the Arts Center would be replaced, long overdue. I of the bond processes and and building, supporting, doing the planning around new spaces. But what I'd like to think is that, we really built an amazing team. We improved the aesthetics, and we improved, I think the emotional vibe and the welcoming environment. That's the Dougherty Arts Center, which I think is queued up now for an actual new space, which under the leadership, of Guinevere Webb and folks like, Laura Esparza, and really the community members that are tied to it, it's a pretty tremendous honor to see it finally get its due in that way. After the Dougherty, I landed over at Creative Action, working with Karen Lachelle and a lot of the amazing leaders over there, and really kind of was put in place to bring the community-based programs to sort of a 2.0 or level. So that was a portfolio of teen arts collectives, which included Color Squad, the Youth Cinema Collective, and Changing Lives Youth Theater Ensemble. Some intergenerational programming that ended up getting some funding and sponsorship from St. David's Foundation to work with elders. It was primarily African-American elders with sort of generational ties to East Austin. Later working, those programs also were deployed inside the HACA sites, Housing Authority, City of Austin. And then doing just sort of community activations that kind of bridge the gap and use, the influence and the celebration of creative action to kind of dip our toes into that civic engagement. And I think, civic community building work that creative action has long had a reputation for doing, but taking it even deeper and better and broader. So, and then I landed now at the City of Austin, and you read the job description there. A lot of my time, has been absorbed in kind of more than one or really one area of that, which was the cultural funding review process up until very recently, interrupted like everything by the COVID-19 crisis. But we made some, I think, some really great progress and sort of, I think, building common set of references amongst at least the cultural, people that are funded by the Cultural Arts Division in terms of things like racial equity, what's sustainable in terms of funding, what are the values behind, how the funding works. So that's all progress that's been made. And, in June it was a year, but it's been fast and furious. So I hope that wasn't too long-winded. And, in the midst of all that, I've been able to participate with some really outstanding organizations. NALAC, really, I think a lot of my leadership development, really crystallized through NALAC down in San Antonio, National Association of Latino Arts and Culture. And also, I really have to give credit to opportunities with like ARTPLACE. I think ArtPlace was kind of early out in terms of the, philanthropic cultural sector, talking about creative placemaking in a way that actually made sense and wasn't just a buzzword. And I think over the 10-year process of that funding program, having relationships with people like Javier Torres, who's now at CERNA, you got to see the way that creative placemaking matured and was sort of challenged by creative placekeeping, and sort of paying attention as an arts administrator to, this like space development, real estate, all that I think has been beneficial to my career and hopefully the way I've served community. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Okay, that's a lot.
Sorry.
With, just to touch on one little aspect of creative placemaking or creative placekeeping, have you seen ArtPlace's initiative been successful across the nation?
I think they've funded so many projects. It's kind of, I think, successful would kind of be in the eye of the beholder. I think the more successful are the ones that I think are super important are, projects like, I think there was one where a group of Muskogee indigenous folks had made this move to buy back their ancestral land, not the place where they got put on a reservation, but to create like a cultural space and language revitalization, and sort of generational, I guess you could say, curriculum. So those are the ones that I think are super exciting projects. Thinking back on, I think that they set the tone and were able to stabilize, especially, spaces and sort of maturing to a point where they could do really innovative programming. So yeah, I think that, you'd have to ask a lot more folks, as far as the overall success of an initiative like ArtPlace. I think it was influential to other funders, in terms of making sure that approaches were place-based, and having important conversations about how even good efforts of sort of creative placemaking can lead to displacement. Like there was a lot of really great internal dialogue, and I think the projects and then the way that the funding model evolved throughout the 10 years really incorporated that. So was it successful? I guess you'd have to ask folks, but influential, I think certainly, in terms of the way that the cultural sector moves in terms of place and awesome creative projects that speak to community.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good way to put it, because I think that the two that took place here in Austin, I don't know what we're trying to measure their success to, but they were definitely influential in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And this is us changing from the at-large government to districts, and part of that ARTPLACE funding was to go to bring that into play, into action through the lens of an artist.
Right.
I think it was a good. Yeah, it's hard to say successful, but yeah, it was very influential.
Right. I mean, I think you're talking about the Drawing Lines project, right?
Yeah.
Which was right on the heels. And I think that's when I think that was even the year before I got to town, but I was even sort of reading about that project from afar. And then the Tink Farms project was that also funded through?
Yeah, Think East with Fusebox.
Right. I think that, yeah, those are such huge projects and huge ambitions. Like you could look at certain aspects of it, or like even the Drawing Lines, some of the district's projects probably more successful, spoke more to community, had a longer lasting impact, but the fund was brand new. The districts are brand new. Artists intersecting with like community development language was kind of new. So, taking it with a grain of salt, I think it set the tone for, hopefully, good collaboration later. Good projects came out of that. And then looking at Think East, it was influential also, I think, in what was possible, right? It was the community building aspect of it, super successful, right? The forces of development and capitalism being what they are, like later on, the later phases of the project in terms of how things really shook out with actual affordable space for community or arts makers, like that's tough stuff. And, that takes a lot more, I think, resources and support than one organization can have even in one funding cycle to make sure that the agreements of that kind of collaboration stay there, that you have leverage to make sure that everything you envision actually plays out, right? But I know, talking to folks that were involved with that project, whether it's folks like Kara Martinez or even, Poder, like a lot was learned, in terms of how to collaborate, but also, lessons learned about accountability in ambitious projects like that. So.
Yeah, and even does the community want to have a art-centered, art-focused development happen on this site, or is it not the place or the time for that? And is it more about affordable housing and other services that can really provide for the community?
Right. Yeah, I mean, those are juicy conversations, and I think I remember, I think a lot about how in Austin, I think people really deeply care. I think we're also a very civically minded bunch, rowdy about, getting involved. And I think it's like, we kind of need juicy research questions and some community building work and honestly some community agreements about how we engage with each other around these topics, or else, I think maybe it's human tendencies sort of slip into the mix and things get in really good conversations and juicy research questions get derailed, by the urgency of a moment, by personality, by all kinds of factors. And I really do think highly of the Austin community. I think that we can hold space for those conversations and actually maybe have some sort of solution-oriented approach to those types of conversations, Yeah, I was thinking about you kind of calling for that unity at the last Arts Commission meeting and how really critical that is. It sounds like it's touchy-feely stuff, but it really is what gets, it really is, I think, what will mature our cultural sector in the ways that we need.
Yeah, it is so needed in our bigger, broader community, but as you drill down into the smaller subsets like the art community, whatever that term art actually encompasses, because music could be a part of art, but the city currently has them separate. They're within the art community and what the Cultural Arts Division serves and the Arts Commission serves. We really need to have that unity and ability to go out, work together very closely, understand each other, and then go out and get more funding and not just rely on what comes through the channels, but actually advocate together to grow and prosper.
Totally. I think, well, being involved with the cultural funding review process, I've been more curious about like, who are the players in terms of, like bigger picture philanthropy in Austin, and, sometimes it's hard, like we try to, and I think I've been guilty of this, looking at models from the coasts, right? But, the coasts have like a philanthropic like industry, and I think, anyone who wants to challenge me or call me out on this, it's probably worth it. Also, taking it with a grain of salt. I've only been here for 5 years. People have been working a lot harder and longer than me. But when I observe the philanthropic environment in Austin, what I kind of get the impression of, like, there's not an industry, but there's big players, and for better or for worse, one of the big players is the city of Austin, government funding, the funding pot for cultural funding is larger than what a lot of cities have. Obviously, there's a lot of debate on the benefits and the detriments of the reliance on the hot tax as interpreted. There's been a lot of debate on that from government. So city of Austin, right? Cultural arts. And then I think you have family foundations. You got St. David's, Dell, a lot of those groups. And this is not a jab because I think they do fund excellent work, but it's kind of like you have to do social services and arts, to kind of get the funding from them, or you have to have a pitch that is really tied to their funding priorities. Even looking at Austin Community Foundation, which, as I understand it, some time ago stopped funding arts explicitly. So, our big foundations, there's some sort of dissonance in terms of how cultural arts is part of the fabric and the foundation of a healthy society and civic environment. And really, for me, I feel like a public health imperative, right? And then you have the third kind of player, which I think is, entrepreneurial culture, or the entrepreneurial class of Austin. Well, there are some amazing people. Sometimes they use a discourse and a vocabulary that I don't understand. And maybe that's a place where I need to make more connections as a government sort of funder. But I feel like you see these kind of fits and starts of supporting culture in these different sort of players, but there's not like a convening of these players, right? And who brings them together? Some folks have said, oh, maybe that's the role of the city of Austin. Maybe that was supposed to be the role, or some people see is the role that the Austin Creative Alliance is playing, right? But the progress doesn't, is not, there's progress and fits and starts, but like having those high level conversations and playing the egos back for a little bit, I think really could make some progress. And because I feel like there's an abundance of wealth here. I think we just have to build some community and shared assumptions and really elevate, cultural arts in those three areas, because it's got to be, there's a debate like, oh, hot taxes or general fund. Honestly, looking at where we're at, it has to be bigger. And the ideas that support the arts have to go beyond, general fund from the city of Austin or hot taxes from visitors to the city of Austin. Like that, I see the moral debate there, right? Of like the sort of moral arguments of how we should support the arts, or the anxiety that sort of only appealing to tourism or whatever that means to people creates for people, or the problematic aspects of like this outside gaze defining culture in Austin. But, I think some people have navigated that really well. I think that there's something to be said for our even most, niche, weird, edgy, hybrid art. Like outsiders should be seeing that stuff, right? That's kind of who we are. It shouldn't be like the highest profile or, safe or institutional art. I think those folks, need to be exposed to that stuff, which is, maybe it's a question of marketing too. Anyways, I'm kind of ranting, but that's kind of how I see some of the potential for growth in our sector, in our community in Austin.
Yeah, and I think that's such a integral part of the city's core being, is that experimental side of it, like the ability to not necessarily have to be beholden to the institutional standards, but to be able to do that really weird stuff that kind of gave Austin its name of a weird city.
Right. I agree, you know, and I think a concrete example of this is, you know, we made a move to sort of push like some of the cultural contractors. There's a requirement to, you know, to sort of list your event, right? And it was formally through the website that was with Austin Creative Alliance, but you know, just really for the reasons of the sheer reach of Visit Austin, we were trying to get our cultural contractors to put their content there to be viewed, you know, by the world, and maybe even it's more important now for, you know, our weird and edgy stuff to insist and sort of assert themselves in those kind of platforms. You know what I mean? I think I'm sorry, I'm on my mind is like, there's just been some really, you know, Black Fret made a good pivot with their events. Fuse Boxes transition, like that was impressive, you know. It was super funky and cool. I think it had a lot of integrity to the spirit of Fusebox making that switch. You know, I don't know how attendance it was, but it felt good, you know, participating in Fusebox. And you know, what a chore that must have been to make that transition and still keep the spirit of that experimental vibe alive, you know. There's a lot of learning to be seen, even how people are making the transition now.
Yeah, and I think an interesting aspect of what we're doing in the virtual realm, and what, you know, we spoke a little bit about what Big Medium's doing with the artist registry, and this is a whole other tangent at some point for us to discuss, but the idea of being able to capture history or a moment, current times, or even like a year ago. I think this, like you were saying about Now Playing Austin or Visit Austin, or how we showcase what we do outside of Austin to a national, international audience, and not just what we do, but what we have done, and kind of give a better sense of the culture of the city. Because when Big Medium produces an East Austin studio tour, I think we, for a brief moment, have, or if you hold on to a catalog, you have this snapshot, but it goes away. Mm-hmm. And I think we need better ways of tracking the culture and the creative. So now here's the tangent, which is, you and I were talking about data behind this, and like, how do we look at that data? How do we better understand the creative community and those who contribute to culture, and not only use that for advocacy or showing economic impact of that community, but also just to be able to wrap your hands around it and say, like, I understand who these people are, and I can actually do more work to serve them. Because I know that's what the Cultural Arts Division is looking to do, is to, you know, restructure the core funding program, which is funded by HOT, right, with equity at the forefront.
Right. I think that you know, we have some in economic development department, right, which is what cultural arts is under. We've got some really good folks that have upped the profile. Like, it sounds really technical and maybe even nerdy or wonky, but like when the city of Austin puts out events, like making a transition to something like Eventbrite, where we can track where actually people are coming from their districts, so that people know we're doing genuine outreach, right? Like, that's a big step. We've kind of adopted a CRM where we can actually, you know, when it comes to commission and commissioners, you know, rightfully so, questioning us on, are we getting the word out? Now we can actually see how many people have opened the emails that we send out to everyone, right? And who's opening it and where they're at, in a way, right? So this helps us make a strong a case that we're actually really, it keeps us honest that we're doing what we're supposed to do, you know, as the city of Austin. And so I think, you know, organizations have to sort of think about how equity plays into the data that they're asking of their people, how they're collecting it, having honest conversations about who's coming to your events, maybe who's watching them digitally online. All this is within grasp, you know, and we, you know, as the city of Austin, we're looking to hopefully allow in our contract amendments. You know, it's interesting. The crisis has allowed us to have a really critical insight on, you know, we know that we are supposed to, you know, fund contract deliverable activities, but with no clear end in sight of, you know, COVID, we have to kind of switch things up and think about how to support our sector. We have to think about how to help people survive and evolve, right? So some of that includes contract amendments that, you know, will allow people to maybe make investments in technology that will allow them to do these types of things and you know, and stay, whether it's data collection or live streaming, you know, these are really critical things. And I think that, you know, organizations, even wherever you're at in terms of how big or small you are, there's something you can do from very cheap to very expensive to use data to inform your storytelling, right? So that you're not just kind of shooting from the hip and using anecdotes about how you are or are not advancing in terms of racial equity or other, you know, aspects of success of your arts organization. You know, zooming out bigger, I think, you know, when you observe conversations in government, what happens often, and me and you were talking about this, Shay, is like, there's this sort of unfortunate false kind of equivalence where artists get kind of put against, somehow they're like a different category, or cultural workers, I'll say, let's like expand to the word cultural workers, somehow are not included when we think of the profile of people who are suffering right now in Austin, right? And maybe people see when we're talking about relief or we're talking about funding or prioritizing cultural workers, they don't see, you know, a person who is a construction worker and a mariachi, a woman who is a single mom, who is writing grants, who is also, you know, rehearsing in the evenings. And on top of that, both of these people are like, you know, doing favor deliveries. Like, and I think honestly, that's the base of cultural workers in Austin. It's not all folks like you and me who are like privileged, frankly, enough to hold some sort of administrative position or, you know, having this sort of social cachet. It's just, it's real everyday folks, right? And I think a lot about how I wonder where, you know, organizations and government can collaborate to sort of, I guess, lend more insight and reality to who the cultural workers of Austin are, right? Because I think when stuff gets tough, you know, people are like, they question the relevancy of the arts, right? And kind of full circle, we've seen really established local arts agencies been gutted during COVID-19, right? Some of them funded through hot taxes or ticket tax. Some of them are part of the general fund. But what scares me about that is like, did the community not have the were the hearts and minds of the community, you know, I guess, invested enough in the arts to defend it, really, regardless of the funding source. You know what I mean? So what this tells me is that maybe what we can do is use data to tell a better story about who the cultural workers of Austin really are. So when we have these tough conversations, when resources are limited, we don't have sort of false comparisons or binaries between, you know, this person who's on the margins and artists, right? Like, because that's just not true. We know who we work with. We know the margins that some of our organizations operate on, you know, doing the work that we do. Anyhow, I digress.
Yeah, I really think it's such an interesting conversation and something that we should really dig into, is trying to figure out who we all are, like who are the people who are all contributing to the culture of this city. And then I think if we can unite behind that body, that group of people, it just seems like we would have such a broad and hopefully cohesive group to just go and say, like, we are an essential part of the city, and we need, whether it's to the city or to, you know, private funders. I believe that there's just such power to grow the pie, to use the terminology of the time.
You know, speaking of funding, I want to drop, while like we're all, you know, for the folks listening, I'm going to plop some of the funding that just went live. This is the CARES Fund. I'm going to put in the chat here the Small Business Relief Grant that's live. Please don't wait, people. Look at the eligibility. If you run your arts, if you run an arts business, please look into it. There's also the nonprofit relief grant that I just posted in the chat. The Better Business Bureau is sort of fielding questions. If you go to those pages, you're going to get all the detail that you need to apply for those funds. So I just want to keep it real and make sure that our listening folks here have these resources. Also, Charlene, I see all your comments, and I think you've showed up to some of our cultural arts funding events. We appreciate that. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm happy to take your questions. It sounds like you have a lot of concerns about the way funding is playing out, and I don't want to ignore your comments. So I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you can feel free to reach out to me, okay? I just want to acknowledge.
Yeah, no, that's good. So we are going to keep our conversation going, but we're also going to open things up to Q&A. And if you want to raise your hand and have your voice ask a question of Alberto, do it. Or you can use the Q&A feature, and I'll try to keep an eye on that. You can also chat any question you may have. But if you do have a question, we'd love for you to use your own voice and say hello. Onward. Since we hit a little lull, I just had to comment on the Texans for the Arts Advocacy Day at the Capitol.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You holding the rattlesnake.
I had to do it. I had to do it. I think Jordan had it too, you know, and I think I want to give, that's actually a great point, you know. We need to give a shout out to folks like Anne Graham, right, and Chris, and like there's a lot of advocacy happening at the state level, and I'm sure to make sure that the federal funding coming down the pipeline, you know, the existing streams of funding for the arts, like those are people that advocate for that. You know, I know Cookie Ruiz, maybe yourself, you know, John Reedy, ACA. I just want to give a lot of props to the people that are continuously advocating, you know, at the federal level. And I learned a lot, you know, going to Arts Advocacy Day that time. I learned a lot more than just how to hold the snake. But that was
I'm gonna share that again just because.
Yeah, that was a cool part of it. Yeah, I think Jordan has one too. These guys were really excited. I think they got a kick out of it. So. Yeah.
So that was Texans for the Arts under Anne Graham going to the state capitol. That was the rotunda, or no, an outdoor courtyard. And it's a big day where we go and advocate to representatives across the state of Texas. And at the same time, there was the Rattlesnake Advocacy Group, doing the same thing, like advocating for rattlesnake preservation.
I guess they have an annual roundup somewhere, and it's part of their thing they've been doing for years and years and years. It's a big deal. Culture moves in mysterious ways.
It does. It does. Let's see. We do have a question. Oh no, it's Charlene using the question to say thank you.
No problem.
So, curious to hear, to whatever degree you are comfortable describing or talking to us about the consulting work that the Cultural Arts Division is going through in regards to core funding, and what maybe you, or maybe it's a shared vision, but what does the future look like?
Right. So, you know, I think I can try to find a link. You know, folks that want to know exactly what went down at the last Arts Commission meeting. The Arts Commission is sort of supporting I guess you could say a racial equity forward approach to the funding matrix for this fiscal year coming up. Really looking back, I'm just speaking for myself, I'm glad, and I know this was even controversial just a few months ago, but adding an additional interim year, you know, keeping the folks that were in the funding pot for core funding and cultural heritage festivals. I'm glad that was one less disruptive thing, especially with COVID going down. Basically, what has happened is we've tried, again, like I told you, made some contract amendments that hopefully ease the burden on our diverse cultural contractors, whether that's extending timelines, whether that's working with folks in terms of how they're using the funds. We've tried to do that. And you know, we also, again, the commission made its recent decision about moving forward. What we're looking at is really when we talk about a transformational change in terms of the guidelines, how the programming is structured, we're still hoping to do that. And I think that we've sent a clear message to the community consistently that a change is coming. And likely, you know, fiscal year 22 is going to be that year, you know, with a drastic reduction of hot funds. You know, it really changed the whole landscape of how that decision could look. I'd like to think that a lot of the same values will be in place, even though we're having a reduced pot of money. Hopefully that doesn't cloud our thinking in terms of making sure we're advancing racial equity, that we're, you know, the city, we're looking internally, that it's not this Byzantine process for people to navigate, because there's equity and racial equity issues in that. Like the complications of the process, the application, how people get paid, we're thinking of all that stuff. We realize that, you know, it doesn't matter the good intention or the bad intention, but that is a tough process, especially when you don't have organizational capacity or full teams to, you know, to navigate the requirements of these grants. So that all said, we, you know, all the feedback, which we kind of we paused, you know, in February after our last community conversation about the cultural funding process. That's not going away, but I think what's kind of exciting, kind of queuing back to your, you know, call for unity in the cultural arts community. What we've decided is economic development is we looked at our live music fund, which obviously has had some customization, you know, in terms of the current moment, its current format kind of customized for more relief funding. But looking forward, we're looking at the Music and Entertainment Division Live Music Fund, which is also hot tax funded. And we're looking at the Heritage Tourism Division's Heritage Grants, which really is about preserving cultural space and giving assistance to cultural spaces. We're looking at wrapping those into or weaving them into the cultural funding review process, so that hopefully, because the reality is there's probably folks that, you know, apply for cultural funding, who also apply for CSAP, who also apply for the Heritage Tourism thing, and maybe the Live Music Fund, right? So we internally are looking at how we can, you know, for lack of a better word, standardize those programs. It's got the same funding pot. We all work in big C culture. I'm sure the community doesn't enjoy the, you know, the, what do I want to say here? That the ad hoc differences between them. Maybe we can look at cleaning it up and making it a more hospitable customer service experience for the community, you know, with equity at the forefront. So we've decided to expand MJR's scope to include those programs too, but that doesn't mean, you know, the recommendations and the feedback that we've collected from the community when it was just for cultural funding is going away. That's forthcoming.
Yeah, and not that there's any need for cultural arts division in the music department to necessarily merge into one, but there's a lot, it seems like there's a lot more connectivity happening, which is much needed and very welcome. Is that a trend you see continuing?
It really is. You know, people have brought up those questions. What would be the detriments and the benefits of you know, a sort of consolidated governance approach to, you know, arts commission, music commission, you know, heritage tourism doesn't have a commission they answer to, right? But all questions I think are on the table right now. So, you know, where it makes sense, we want to make sure that we're creating less barriers and maybe simplifying the governance and the decision-making process for folks, you know, maybe, and really kind of looking at the way we're engaging community, not just to inform y'all, but really we're trying to up the ante of the civic engagement process, right? So not just the people who know how to navigate have a say, whether, you know, that's advocating with their individual council members, the people who can rally up, you know, a bunch of people to speak at council, all good things. But we think there's a lot more people that would like to speak up if the process maybe was speaking more to their reality and lived experience. And that's what we hope to work on moving forward as the Cultural Arts Division. And, you know, with this expanded review with Miss Margie at MJR Consultants.
Yeah. We have a question from one of our attendees. You said you use a CRM to track attendees at events. Have you noticed this being more intuitive and accessible, working and bringing in more attendees compared to, say, just creating a Facebook event and putting it on social media?
Yes, absolutely. The answer is yes, because, you know, and I'm not receiving any funding from Eventbrite for this, but one of the great things was that, you know, here we are, you know, we were trying to put together these, we also put them in different parts of the city where we were doing the cultural funding review process. One was at Lamar Middle School. One was at the Millennium Youth Entertainment Complex I think we had one at the Dougherty Arts Center. Anyways, we did it. We tried to like geolocate it in an equitable way, but that creates problems for people in getting around Austin. So one of the benefits is you can see who's signing up, and you can see where you need to up your ante in terms of like, oh, it looks like District 2 only has 5 people attending this event. You can, you know, tailor your outreach to focus on that area or those communities. So I think, and I think Eventbrite, it links with Facebook. So, you know, I could go on and on about this, but yeah, the short answer is things are getting a lot more intuitive to use. And I encourage, you know, people to, as best as they can, get over that anxiety of technology, because it's only going to benefit your organization in this transition, you know, and maybe find an ally who's comfortable with navigating these things. If it's not you, you know, I really encourage folks to at least give it a good college try in terms of navigating these technologies, especially in tracking your communities and your audiences.
Can you give us a quick little synopsis of what the Live Music Fund is?
Oh boy, I right now I know that I think the Live Music Fund was focused on musicians and music organizations. You know what? I'm gonna pass, and I want to get back to you on that, because honestly, it's because of the demands of the community, because of some of the expectations coming from council. It's pivoted multiple times, you know, in the last couple months. But anyone who has a direct question on that, I'm happy to answer that and connect you with my colleagues like Stephanie Vergara or Erica Shamley or Kimberly McCarson, excuse me, who are working directly on that and could provide you a much more accurate answer.
Cool. Remember, the terminology is hard pass.
That's right.
My question was about that was,
hey, Peggy, thank you, Peggy. Peggy's in the house.
Oh, nice.
Peggy put the link, everybody, for you to find that.
Oh my goodness.
Okay. Right.
I was curious about the current, probably because of all the structural elements and CARES Act funding, the current relief funding out there is very much focused on the impacts already felt by COVID-19 and not those that will be felt, the future of this arts community. The Creative Space Disaster Relief Fund, I've been on calls and I've looked at that quite a bit, and it was all about this moment of time that you weren't able to pay. But very often organizations have a little bit of enough in the bank just to keep themselves going and get through these next few months. And then it's the future months, those few ones down the road. And I was curious if the Live Music Fund was structured in a way, anyway, I would be interested to see if there was something for the arts that was less relief funding, that was less held and bound by impacts you've already felt, but impacts that you will feel, that we're seeing coming down the road.
Yes. So I'm going to pop into the chat, like the official language from EDD about this, so that people are really clear on it, and that folks really should make sure that they are probably putting a site, atxrecovers.com really should be in your favorites, because that's where a lot of the updates. And so, you know, 2 of the funds that I kind of already posted, I went live. There's more to come, right? So I explicitly shared the small business, which is live, and the nonprofit application, 1 million of which is earmarked for cultural arts organizations, right? You know, I think, and then forthcoming will be the funding, and I think, and then it could change, y'all, because it's all a negotiation between city departments, but right now the plan is to have 3.5 million for individual cultural workers, right? Individual creatives. Hopefully that will provide some relief for people that aren't, you know, necessarily affiliated with organizations. I think, you know, how do I say this? You know, the truth of the matter is, I think that the CARES money, which has been, there's been 3 waves. There's been 3 waves, as I understand it. Way back before, the first wave was really for medical facilities, right? The second wave was like for PPP supplies. And the third wave, which was sort of discretionary to the cities, this is Austin's first go at using CARES fund for anything except those two previous purposes, right? So as you might imagine, there was a lot of negotiation between, and it was, I think, cooperative. Like, so just to drop the curtain for everybody, our, economic development had to sort of get in there and collaborate with public health, with neighborhood housing and community development to say, where are the priorities right now? And how do we approach this together? And what's the right way to cut up the pie, right? And it was explicitly relief funding, and there's certain like limitations on the funding that the government provides, right? Which aren't even in our control. So that's not an excuse, I think, to say what there, and allegedly there's more CARES funding coming down the pipeline, which I hope can be more flexible, right? But, I think in city government, you deal with all these different pressures and urgencies, so I think, without latitude, I think I'm pretty proud because what I've seen from a lot of other cities, some of the very little of the CARES money at all is going to some of the art sector. So what I hope is that the future waves of CARES funding provide more flexibility in terms of, Shay, like, not just explicit time-bound COVID impacts, right? But maybe looking forward to what else you can do with the funds, We wanted to make sure that they were really relief focused. The individual fund, I think, is being structured in a way that it's really pretty broad, the application, like the individual fund that's gonna come up, it's really using it for basic needs. Not unlike some of the earlier funds that were for the sort of general community, but really focused on cultural workers, right? As essential and vulnerable workers. So I think, it's totally up to the city. I think at the same time, that all said, even though maybe like speaking for myself, I think there's a good sound logic for this first opportunity that the city got to be pretty relief focused. I think it's all within the citizens' rights and within, everyone should advocate according to the way they need to, right? So, I know that there's momentum in the community asking for an additional 5 million to come from somewhere for the arts community, looking at the deficit we're facing and the hot taxes, and maybe looking at like what is obviously not enough, from the CARES fund. And I think that's good. Maybe it's coming back to that unity and telling the story of exactly who these cultural workers are that are going to poise, the community for, I guess, how do I say, an effective ask, going forward. So I hope I didn't talk a whole lot of nothing, but I kind of just want to give you some of the logic behind why it's sort of more explicitly focused on relief for the time being. And, I'll be really honest, without throwing anyone under the bus, some people question explicitly, assisting and targeting cultural sector workers altogether. So, there are people who probably thought like, why are we including arts nonprofits in this relief funding? Why are we explicitly trying to help cultural workers when all these other people are suffering, So this is not to say, oh, poor city, but, there's a lot of other pressures that the, government is making and sort of trying to prioritize, the current CARES funding, the way it's manifesting, even if it's not as flexible or inclusive as we want it to be just yet.
Yeah, and I'm curious if how the city is going to handle the disbursement of the funds. The National Endowment for the Arts, they did an approach that was taking, they got 3,110 applications and they funded about 830 to a flat rate, $50,000.
Right.
And then the TCA, Texas Commission on the Arts, did a different approach. They just kind of spread it really thin across everyone. And I'm curious of that, if of that 1 million for nonprofits in the arts, is the approach going to be, because the max is 20,000, are they going to fund X number at 20,000, or are they going to try to spread it as far as it'll go?
Yeah, I have to check in. I know that my colleagues, Laura Odegaard and Megan, were involved in the application for the city of Austin to get that NEA funding. And it was, I think, less than a month ago when they applied. So I don't have details on exactly how that pot will be dispersed. And I'd have to defer to, folks like Jim Bob McMillan as far as how, TCA is dispersing their funds. I don't have information on that yet.
We have another question from a board member of Big Medium, Siwa. Is there an arts advocacy organization that offers courses like SCORE on the basics, the steps the artist should follow to process applications, process grants, find grant writers, navigate the process of being empowered as an artist? If artists are armed with knowledge and the ability to expand their knowledge, they can become more effective in the ability to continually earn money. Can you identify organizations who offer these types of services?
I mean, you know, maybe I don't mean to be Captain Obvious, but definitely Americans for the Arts, I think, focuses on, you know, helping organizations prime themselves for, you know, effective pitches to funders. So I'd say Americans for the Arts, which you know, is kind of a standby. I'm gonna plunk in here grant makers in the arts, you know, and if I think both of these organizations, especially now, they're membership based. I think their membership base fees are more reasonable than ever. So it's a good time. It's a good time to get in those networks, arts folks, you know, getting in the mix with advocacy and research-based groups like Americans for the Arts, like grant makers in the arts, is a really good look right now. And once you are a member, or right now, a lot of things are more open sourced, you know, jumping into their webinars, looking at their best practices documents. That's, I know, something that we do as the City of Austin to try to stay up on those things. You know, I hope that's a good answer for that question. Yeah. Oh, excuse me. Also, I'll say, if you want to, I think right now, for folks that are interested, I know that I think the City of Austin has, for folks that are in the cultural, people who are culturally funded, we have a group called Big Austin that's providing free business coaching. So folks that want to diversify their revenue models, you know, if we can't directly connect you to that, we can definitely, as the City of Austin, point people in those directions locally. TALAarts.org. TALA has clinics on as far as help for artists on accounting and business. You know, that was definitely pre-COVID a thing that folks were really interested in learning about. It's obviously still important, and, you know, beyond sort of relief funding, something that folks, I think, are very interested in. So feel free to reach out to us as the City of Austin, and if we'll try to point you in the right direction at the very least.
Any more questions from our attendees? Not that you're hard to reach, but this is a special moment to ask Alberto anything.
33.
Like, how do you like Texas weather as opposed to Seattle weather?
I just learned that you don't wear like pomade or gel in your hair or anything like that, which is maybe a thing that only young people do, but I guess I just outed myself as still like wearing like gel. But, you know, I don't do like LA looks or depths. I do like the finer quality gel. But I remember when I moved to Austin and I didn't have any winter clothes, and I work at the Dougherty Arts Center, and I walked outside and my eyes were stinging, and I was you know, sweating in a long sleeve shirt, and the brothers who work for facilities at Parks and Recreation had a good laugh at me. So I learned that, you know, I learned how to adapt to that after time. I also learned why people amble so slowly in the summer. If you watch people walking in the summertime, they're conserving their body energy. But at first I was like, why do people saunter so slowly in Austin? But, you know, you learn these things over time.
That's good. Good anecdotes from a Seattleite coming to Austin.
I kind of wanted to, you know, plug a few things if there's no questions. You know, I think other organizations doing interesting and important work out there. I'll just throw in the chat here. Like, I've learned a lot from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. They're a really cool organization. Hey, thank you, Jennifer Hall. But they're a really cool organization. They're kind of provocative. They use this very federal looking symbol because we don't have a department or a minister of arts and culture. You know, we have the NEA, which is constantly in danger in the, you know, what they do is they really take a lot of really cool grassroots community driven arts practices and ideas. You know, they were one of the first folks beyond Native people themselves calling for, you know, Native land acknowledgements. And they have a really cool thing I've just plunked into the chat called their high impact, low infrastructure database, which are community sort of artistic community building and community engagement projects that are really kind of cheap and easy to do. So I just plunked that in it's fun to peruse. Obviously, some of them are probably not transferable in times of COVID, but there's some really cool ideas that, you know, I've sourced in the past. I think I wanted to do, as far as, you know, some people that I admire in terms of the research that they're doing for the sector. Angie Kim and her team at the Center for Cultural Innovation in I think San Francisco. They're just doing such amazing research. I think they're partnered with the University of, I can't remember, I think it might be University of Ohio, but they're just doing some incredible drill down work in terms of, you know, the cultural sector, you know, doing analysis down to the granular level of like how crowdfunding works by discipline, you know, and by artistic discipline. So whether you're a hip hop artist or a country artist, like they're just doing some incredible stuff that really, I think, is showing the future of the way cultural work is evolving, the way that it's supported and funded. And so anyways, I just recommend looking into their work. They're really great too. And then another kind of intriguing thing, which, you know, we had a conversation earlier about how the arts is financed. I've been only kind of perusing it, but there's a group called Upstart Collab. And they've been working with the city of New York. And I think they have an inclusive creative economy fund. And anyone out there can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think they're doing is they're challenging the world of impact investing, which we have those people in Austin, right? Like sort of social venture impact investing. Well, when you look at sort of the global footprint of impact investing, arts and culture, including like culinary, is like less than 1%. So what is it about arts and culture that maybe it's us, we kind of squirm at the idea of like shareholders in our work or like investment, but you know, I think it's worth a go, because what they're trying to do is challenge arts organization, even nonprofits, to sort of like think about shareholder value in their business model. So it's really intriguing, and I encourage people to check that out. It's quite fascinating because, you know, I think we have to think big and wide about, you know, like I said, beyond hot tax or general fund, you know, we have to be more creative as a sector and play our role. So interesting work going on there too.
That's great. Well, it's noon. That went fast. He always does. Thank you so much, Alberto.
Yeah, shout out to Ron Berry. You know, appreciate you too. You know, folks like Shay and Ron Berry, and you know, people in the community. You know, folks from the Carver Cultural Arts Center, the MAC. Everything. You know, people like Dave Sullivan inviting me to spaces. I just want to, you know, raise my hands to the community here that's welcomed me. I think anything I have to offer is only information I've gained from teachers here in the community, whether that's other arts leaders, whether it's community themselves. You know, I'll give a shout out to Six Square Cultural Arts District. I've gotten to work with folks like Nefertiti Jackman and Kihara Keys, learning a lot, you know, from community elders out there, you know, like Susana Alamanza, Daniel Yanes, La Peña, you know, give a shout out to people like Capitol View Arts. There's so much there's a real wealth of wonderful people who really believe in, I think, the promise of a Austin that can overcome, you know, the inequities of that we've inherited. So I just want to give a shout out to, you know, all the community members that I think give me permission to do my work and give me knowledge to do my work. So thank you, everybody. And I'm in touch.
Yeah, well, please keep up the good work.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for being here. And join us next week. We have the amazing Deborah Roberts speaking with the also amazing Badahem McConan on the 16th. So come back from the coffee chat. Thank you again, Alberto. Have a great day.
Everybody stay strong.